Officer Daniel Reed stood at the edge of the sunlit sidewalk, arms folded firmly over his crisp navy blue uniform, feeling the late afternoon heat radiate through the fabric. The sky was a vaulted dome of pale blue, the sun low enough to cast warm, slanting beams across Brookfield's wide streets and neatly trimmed lawns. This was not a place that often stirred excitement, just rows of modest houses, clipped hedges, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing between them. There was an unassuming peace here, a quiet rhythm Daniel had grown accustomed to over the years. He took in the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint aroma of someone grilling burgers a few doors down. He could even pick up the distant hum of an air conditioner laboring against the lingering summer warmth. He prided himself on knowing every corner of this small American town, from the old diner that opened before dawn to the hardware store that closed its doors promptly at 5. He liked that Brookfield held few surprises, that his role as a lawman here felt predictable and anchored. It reassured him to believe that real trouble rarely drifted onto these sidewalks. The uniform he wore gave him purpose. It marked him as part of the fragile balance that sustained this quiet existence. In his early 30s, he was confident, perhaps too confident, in his sense of order and in his judgment of others. He'd learned to read people, or so he thought, the way a suspicious glance, a nervous tick, or an unsteady gait could reveal someone's intentions. He considered himself fair, maybe even just, though he rarely reflected too deeply on what that truly meant. As he scanned the scene before him, his gaze caught on a solitary figure standing near a curbside trash can. The man, slender, shoulders slightly rounded, was rummaging through discarded scraps. Daniel couldn't make out the details of his face from this distance. The man wore a well-worn denim jacket, and something about the set of his posture gave the impression of a quiet discomfort. He seemed out of place, neither enjoying the late afternoon calm nor hurrying on his way. Instead, he lingered there, searching for something Daniel couldn't see. The man's clothing looked faded, scuffed at the edges, and his movements were careful, as though he were sifting through the trash with purpose. There was no visible contraband, no weapon, nothing immediately threatening. Still, Daniel felt a prickling unease that he found difficult to ignore. He tried to rationalize this discomfort. Surely, any officer would take interest in a stranger picking through refuse on a quiet residential street. Was the man looking for something to sell? Planning to dump something incriminating? The thoughts moved rapidly through Daniel's mind, each one hardening his posture. Yet he realized something else, too. An uglier undercurrent he struggled to acknowledge. The man was black. Daniel rarely interrogated how that fact influenced his reaction, but in this moment he couldn't help noticing the subtle friction between the way he perceived the stranger and the image of Brookfield he carried in his head. Perhaps, he told himself, the distrust was simply because the man was unfamiliar. This was a small town after all, and new faces stood out. Yes, that must be it. Not his race, just his unfamiliarity. Still, a small voice inside questioned why he was so quick to assume ill intent. He shifted his weight and unfurled his arms, resting one hand on his belt near the holster. The late afternoon light spilled across his face, illuminating the faint lines of tension around his eyes. The old oak trees, with their thick trunks and dusty green leaves, swayed gently, as if trying to soothe the quiet discomfort settling on the block. A distant car rumbled by, not slowing down, not noticing the subtle drama unfolding here. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to set aside the odd sense of unease. He considered calling out immediately, demanding the man step away from the trash can, but something made him hesitate. He observed the stranger's hunched shoulders, the slight dip of his head. There was a quiet determination in the man's motions, as though he were searching for something specific rather than just sorting random debris. Some small object, perhaps? A glint of metal caught the light as the stranger shifted a piece of cardboard, and Daniel tried to make sense of it, his curiosity mixing uneasily with his suspicion. In that instant, despite himself, Daniel felt his upper lip curl into a faint sneer. It was a reflex he hated to admit was there, an instinct he refused to label as prejudice but could not entirely deny. His jaw set, He should say something, break the silence, establish his authority. He was, after all, tasked with maintaining order. And what was order if not recognizing when something or someone didn't fit? The warmth of the day pressed against his back, a slow burn that reminded him how still he'd been standing. He took a step forward, his polished shoes tapping lightly on the pavement. He noticed that the man froze for a second, as if sensing the officer's presence, before continuing more slowly. There was tension in the air. Something unspoken and charged. Daniel straightened, inhaling the scent of cut grass once more, and then prepared to speak. He turned his shoulders toward the man, the badge on his chest catching a sliver of light. Just a question or two, that's all. He'd get to the bottom of why this stranger was here, and then he could move on, back to the routines he knew so well. He didn't intend to be cruel, only thorough. Yet a part of him knew he was not merely being thorough. He was indulging a suspicion that came not from evidence, but from a murkier place in his own mind. He moved closer, steps purposeful, determined. The man remained focused on the trash can, though the subtle stiffening of his spine suggested he was aware of the officer's approach. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound abrupt in the hushed afternoon, as if asserting his claim on this street, on this narrative of safety he upheld. He wanted to appear in control, the calm authority figure the uniform promised. He wanted to believe he was doing the right thing. But even as he opened his mouth to speak, a nagging doubt whispered in the back of his mind. Why had he already formed an opinion before uttering a single word to this man? Was he truly following his duty, or was he guided by an impulse he refused to name? He brushed the thought aside. He had a job to do. He would question the man, ascertain what was going on, and restore order. Whatever that meant in a place so ordinary, so predictable. He had no idea that what he was about to say, what he was about to do, would send a crack through his tidy understanding of the world and cast a long shadow on his beliefs. Without realizing the full weight of that future regret, Officer Daniel Reed stepped forward into the golden light, preparing to confront the man and set events in motion that could never be undone. Daniel approached the man with slow, deliberate steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the asphalt. The late afternoon sun continued to cast its warm glow over the block, but the pleasant heat that had earlier lulled the neighborhood into quiet calm now felt smothering. He could feel the perspiration gathering at the back of his neck, dampening the collar of his uniform. He wanted to project confidence and authority, but beneath his crisp attire and the badge gleaming on his chest, something more uneasy stirred. He refused to acknowledge it, not fully. As he neared the stranger, he gave him a thorough once-over. The man wore a frayed denim jacket that had seen better days, the edges worn thin, the blue faded almost to white in places. His sneakers looked as if they'd been through countless miles, soles scuffed, laces fraying at the tips. The cap he wore was pulled low, and though Daniel couldn't see his face clearly at first, he noted the tension in the man's posture. The way his shoulders hunched slightly forward suggested a readiness to defend himself, or to flee. Daniel's fingers flexed at his sides, anticipating some form of resistance. When he spoke, his voice was sharper than he intended. "What exactly are you doing there?" he asked, tilting his chin toward the trash can. The words came out clipped, each syllable designed to push the man off balance. He had no firm reason for adopting this tone, yet he persisted. Beneath his stern exterior, Daniel told himself it was part of his job. Anyone acting out of place deserved scrutiny. He was only being vigilant, he reasoned. Yet his heart gave a small, uncomfortable jolt. The man turned at the sound of Daniel's voice. From this close, Daniel could see he was younger than he'd initially assumed, perhaps late 20s. The man had brown eyes that revealed layers of uncertainty and something else. An emotion Daniel couldn't quite decipher. It could have been anxiety, or maybe disappointment, as if he'd expected this kind of confrontation. The silence between them stretched, the low hum of traffic from a distant intersection, and the whisper of a breeze filling the gaps where kindness or understanding might have existed. "My name's Jonathan Morgan," the man offered, voice quiet, but steady. He looked as if he might say more, but Daniel neither encouraged nor acknowledged the introduction. Instead, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. There was something sour and mocking in that sound. and as it escaped his throat, even Daniel was surprised at how easily it came. He heard it echo in his own ears, a note of derision he couldn't fully justify. "Scavenging for something?" Daniel said, gesturing vaguely at the trash can, as if he had caught Jonathan in some petty, embarrassing crime. The words were meant to sting, to provoke a reaction. Maybe Daniel wanted the man to lash out, to trip over his words and reveal a nefarious purpose. Maybe a part of him was seeking validation for his suspicions. He wanted something that would make his unease feel earned. The corners of Daniel's mouth pulled tight into a half-smile that contained no warmth at all. Jonathan flinched almost imperceptibly. He didn't step forward or back, just seemed to tense, drawing slightly inward as though Daniel's voice had pushed him into a smaller space. Still, Jonathan didn't snap or shout. He stood there, caught in the uncomfortable spotlight of Daniel's attention, the golden sunlight still painting the street in gentle hues while the human exchange darkened. His eyes flicked toward the ground, then back at Daniel's face. In that look was a restrained plea, an unspoken hope that perhaps understanding could still emerge from this strained encounter. But Daniel pressed on, letting the silence that followed weigh heavily. He wanted the man to feel uneasy. In fact, some small part of him relished the discomfort. He would never have admitted it, not to himself, and certainly not to anyone else. Yet here he was, towering in his uniform, using the power it afforded him to unsettle a man who had done nothing more suspicious than pick through garbage on a quiet street. The air felt thicker now, the humidity clinging like a damp coat. Each passing second seemed to tighten the space between them, as if the world held its breath, waiting to see who would break first. A distant dog barked, and the sound ricocheted off the rows of houses, fading into the hush of the evening. Daniel caught the faint scent of something acrid, perhaps the refuse in the bin, or maybe just the tang of his own irritation. He studied Jonathan's face more closely now. The young man's lips parted as if he wanted to explain himself, to offer some reason for his presence. Maybe he had one. Maybe it was something entirely innocent, something that would strip the confrontation of all its tension if Daniel would only listen. But Daniel wasn't ready to listen. He was invested in this narrative he'd begun spinning, the one in which Jonathan was a troublemaker, a miscreant lurking where he didn't belong. It was easier that way. It fit the story Daniel was used to telling himself, that he was out here to protect Brookfield's gentle order against those who might disrupt it. Jonathan took a breath and tried again, his voice quiet but resolute. "I was just—" he began, but Daniel interrupted with a short, cutting laugh that barely resembled amusement. "Sure you were," Daniel said, words dripping with sarcasm. He leaned forward slightly, not enough to appear overtly threatening, but enough to signal dominance. He wanted Jonathan to feel his authority, to realize that in this moment Daniel could dictate the terms of their encounter. He waited, letting the tension coil tighter. Jonathan's shoulders slumped a fraction, but his gaze remained steady, refusing to shrink entirely beneath Daniel's scrutiny. For a heartbeat, Daniel wondered what he looked like to Jonathan, a figure bathed in late sunlight, the badge on his chest glinting, a shadow slicing across his lean face, eyes hard and unyielding. He knew he must appear intimidating, maybe even cruel. The thought was disturbing, but he shoved it away. He justified his behavior by the need to confirm that nothing unlawful was happening, yet he was aware that his questions had taken on a strange, mocking twist. He was no longer just doing his job. He was prying into the man's dignity, testing its limits. As the silence stretched on, Daniel's pulse drummed at his temples. He wondered what the next move would be. Would Jonathan protest or attempt to leave? Would Daniel find some excuse to prolong the confrontation? There was a moment, thin as a razor's edge, where a different path might have opened. One where Daniel stepped back, treated Jonathan with decency, and diffused the tension before it turned into something he would regret. But Daniel felt trapped by his own performance of authority. He had begun this in a tone of mockery and suspicion. To soften now would feel like surrender. So he held his ground, feeling the subtle churn of disquiet within himself, and prepared for whatever came next. Their words, or lack thereof, floated in the warm evening air. In those tense moments, the town's familiar peace faltered, as if unsure whether to embrace the descending twilight or to recoil from the unease settling between these two men at the curb. And Daniel, jaw set, arms crossed, waited for Jonathan to slip, to say something that would justify his own hard stare. He did not realize how this choice, his refusal to step out of the role he had cast for himself, would echo through his life, deepening with every second he held that mocking gaze. Jonathan tried explaining himself, his voice measured yet strained, as if he were speaking to someone who didn't quite believe he could form a coherent sentence. He kept his tone carefully even, deliberately calm, despite the tightness pulling at the edges of his words. "Officer," he began, "I've lost something important to me. Something I really need to find." Those words, spoken softly in the hot afternoon air, held a quiet plea. They could have sparked understanding, compassion, or at least curiosity in another listener. Jonathan's voice didn't waver much, but the slight tremor at the end of his sentence gave him away. There was fear in it, anxiety that twined through his every syllable, suggesting that this confrontation mattered more than Daniel realized. This was not the voice of a petty criminal or a troublemaker prowling the neighborhood for mischief. It was the voice of a man whose dignity hovered perilously close to being shattered. Daniel, however, refused to hear it that way. He saw only a figure that didn't fit his tidy mental picture of a proper citizen, and so he kept himself sealed off from the man's vulnerability. Instead of listening, Daniel's mind busied itself arranging damning assumptions. He let his gaze drift contemptuously over Jonathan's stance, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes darted toward the ground and back. In Daniel's world, that kind of body language hinted at guilt or shame, never the heartbreak of someone desperately in need. Daniel crossed his arms again, and the motion was slow, theatrical. He leaned forward slightly, as if to emphasize his height advantage, his status, letting the silence stretch before choosing his next words. "Lost. What?" he said, voice tinged with malice. His tone sharpened as he delivered the blow. "Your pride?" There was a sneer curling the corners of his mouth, a victorious spark in his eyes, as if he'd just scored a clever point. Daniel didn't need Jonathan to respond immediately. He wanted the weight of his insult to land, to provoke or humiliate. Perhaps, somewhere beneath his bristling exterior, Daniel hoped to see Jonathan break character, maybe lash out or give him a reason to escalate. Such a reaction would serve as a neat justification for his suspicion, a little proof to bolster the prejudice gnawing inside him. Jonathan's shoulders sagged under the officer's verbal strike. It was a small, painful collapse of posture, like a piece of paper crumpling inward. He looked away, his gaze sliding toward a patch of cracked pavement. In that moment, Jonathan seemed to vanish into himself, as if determined not to give Daniel the satisfaction of a visible flare of anger or hurt. The pause that followed was thick with all the things Jonathan might have said, but chose not to. He could have protested, thrown the insult back, demanded respect. Instead, he stood there, absorbing the humiliation, waiting for the moment to pass. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed, a distant burst of innocent joy floating on the hot air. It sounded surreal, disconnected from the tension coiled between these two men, as if the town itself couldn't decide which version of reality it wanted to acknowledge, the neighborly facade or the cruel undertones now polluting the scene. Jonathan swallowed, steadying himself. He refused to lash out, though his voice wavered slightly as he tried again, more directly this time. "Officer," he said, each syllable carefully pressed and shaped, "I'm just trying to find my keys." There was a delicate hope in those words, as if Jonathan believed that stating his purpose plainly would finally dissolve the officer's hostility. He spoke slowly, enunciating clearly, making sure the plea was not just heard, but understood. Even now, there was no venom in Jonathan's voice, no stoking of conflict, only the quiet insistence that he was here for a reason that mattered to him, if not to Daniel. And yet Daniel's reaction was immediate, and it was not kind. He shook his head, dismissing the explanation before it could settle into anything Daniel might have to acknowledge. He sneered, a broad, mocking grin blossoming across his face. It radiated a kind of unearned superiority that made Jonathan's attempt at honesty feel puny, almost laughable. The grin deepened, line by line, as if Daniel's face were sculpting itself into a monument of scorn. "Your keys," Daniel repeated, dragging the words across the silence with deliberate skepticism. He said it as though Jonathan had claimed to be searching for something absurd, like buried treasure beneath the asphalt or a missing piece of the sun. Without evidence or reason, Daniel chose to disbelieve, clinging to the script he'd written in his mind. Jonathan, after all, didn't look like a man who belonged here, searching through refuse in broad daylight. He didn't align with Daniel's notion of who fit into Brookfield's tidy normalcy. The officer's voice took on a clipped cadence, every word landing like a small stone thrown at Jonathan's feet. There was no subtlety, no room for compromise in his demeanor. The uniform, the badge, and the training Daniel so prided himself on were meant to uphold justice and order, but now he wielded them as tools of intimidation. He was no longer simply verifying a story. He was belittling a fellow human being, all because Jonathan dared to exist in this moment in a way Daniel couldn't easily categorize. Jonathan stood as still as he could, wrestling with emotions churning inside. Embarrassment and frustration burned hot beneath his skin. He'd been cornered into a role he never asked to play, the hapless stranger under suspicion, forced to prove his innocence not just as a matter of form, but as a matter of personal worth. And yet, even as shame and anger collided in his chest, Jonathan refused to answer aggression with aggression. He might have been angry, he might have been humiliated, but he had not given up on the possibility, however slim, that reason might still prevail. Under a sky that had begun to soften into evening hues, Jonathan tried to catch Daniel's eye, just once, in search of a flicker of understanding. He found none. The uniformed officer remained as he was, hard, unyielding, unwilling to entertain the idea that Jonathan's words could be true. The energy in the air was charged with an unfairness so tangible it could almost be tasted. Jonathan took a slow breath, fighting to keep his composure intact. If he showed his frustration too clearly, if he allowed the hurt to twist his face or crack his voice, he feared it would only feed the officer's assumptions. And so, he stood his ground, saying nothing more for the moment, letting the silence stretch while the uniformed man loomed. In that quiet standoff, both men occupied the same patch of sidewalk, the same block of Brookfield's supposedly decent town, but they might as well have been standing on opposite sides of a great divide. Jonathan waited, keys unfound, dignity eroding with each second he remained under Daniel's cutting stare. And Daniel, smirking, suspicious, stood at a crossroads he didn't yet recognize. Every mocking grin, every dismissive tilt of his head was shaping a memory he would later wish he could rewrite. But for now, he reveled in the cruel certainty of his own perspective. Between them, nothing but a question unanswered. What if, just once, Daniel chose to listen? A concerned bystander, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, paused a few steps away from the tense exchange. She stood near the edge of the sidewalk, a canvas grocery bag resting against one hip, and watched the uniformed officer's posture, the rigid way he confronted the man at the curb. A faint line formed between her brows as she frowned, trying to parse what was happening here. This was Brookfield, after all, a place where most people at least pretended civility, and yet she'd stumbled upon something that felt deeply wrong. "Officer, is this really necessary?" she asked, her tone cautious but firm. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't lower it either. The question, tossed into the still, hot air, carried a quiet plea for reason. Her brown eyes, touched with concern and a hint of disappointment, flicked between Daniel and Jonathan, hoping to find some calm middle ground. The muffled sounds of distant laughter wafted in from a nearby park, where families were enjoying the late afternoon sun. That gentle, happy noise contrasted starkly with the tight coil of hostility at the curb. Daniel felt the intrusion of her voice like an unexpected gust of wind slamming into his back. He stiffened instantly, turning his head just enough to acknowledge her presence without actually meeting her eyes. He resented being questioned, especially here, in public, where anyone could see. In his mind, he was the authority, the figure that kept Brookfield orderly and safe. Having a bystander challenge that role sparked a flare of indignation he couldn't quite contain. He shot her a glare, a single look meant to warn her off. The set of his jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He realized he was breathing more quickly, his heart still caught up in the heated tension of confronting Jonathan. He did not want to explain himself, not to this woman who knew nothing of his daily burdens, nothing of the subtle instincts he trusted to maintain control. He'd come here to do his job, he told himself. Now someone was treating him as if he were out of line. The thought made his chest tighten. He refused to second-guess himself. The breeze picked up just then, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the street and tugging gently at the woman's loose cotton blouse. Daniel wondered if she saw what he saw, a man who didn't belong here, a man who might be trouble. Or perhaps she just saw two people, one in uniform, one in worn clothes, locked in a conversation that felt charged and unkind. He would have liked to dismiss her as someone meddling where she had no business, but something about her gaze, about the small tremor of worry in her voice, made that difficult. It reminded him that there were eyes on him, that his behavior mattered not just to him, but to those witnessing it. His pride, however, refused to back down. He held his ground, shoulders square, chin raised. He flexed his fingers at his sides, the weight of his gear belt a familiar comfort. This was his territory, his role. Who was she to question him? The last thing he wanted to do was show weakness by engaging her concerns. Doing so would admit that she had a right to judge his actions, that he needed to justify himself to anyone other than his commanding officers or the town's residents in a formal complaint. Here, in this moment, he was in charge. Wasn't that what the badge was about? "Move along, ma'am," he said curtly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. He kept his tone sharp, authoritative. There would be no explanation, no gentle reassurance. He gave her a quick, dismissive nod, as if shooing away a stray cat. To him, it was enough. He expected her to comply, to shrink back into the quiet routine of this town's afternoon, and let him handle his business as he saw fit. The woman lingered for a heartbeat longer than he expected, her eyes filled not only with worry but also a rising anger. She did not speak again, but the look she left him with was heavy. It was as though she had taken a measure of him and found him wanting. She saw the cruelty dancing beneath his uniformed facade, the way he used his authority like a blunt instrument. Perhaps she wanted to say more, to challenge him further, but there was a brittleness in the air that warned her against it. Her shoulders fell slightly, and her gaze slid over to Jonathan, who stood there in silence, eyes lowered. Jonathan's posture hurt her to witness, his quiet resignation, the slump of his shoulders as if he were bracing himself for another blow. She offered him a small, sympathetic smile that Daniel did not see or chose to ignore. Then, shoulders lifting with a resigned sigh, the bystander turned and continued on her way, the gentle scuff of her sandals fading quickly. With her gone, Daniel's attention snapped back to Jonathan. The confrontation had not vanished with her departure. It only felt starker now. The absence of her presence left a hollow silence that weighed on the afternoon light. Daniel's pride hummed in his chest like a taut wire, reverberating with tension he refused to admit was partly his own making. He looked down at Jonathan, who remained quiet, still trying to hold himself together under the officer's scrutiny. Jonathan's gaze remained firmly on the ground, not because he lacked the will to meet Daniel's eyes, but because he knew what would greet him if he did. He stood there in a kind of internal battle. On one side, the urge to speak out, to assert himself, to demand respect. On the other side, the painful knowledge that defiance could invite more trouble, more pain. Embarrassment coiled with frustration inside him. He felt the burning humiliation of being reduced to less than a man by a stranger who knew nothing about him. The distant laughter in the park drifted into the background as if muffled by the tension here. The warm glow of the afternoon sun, still painting the leaves golden and illuminating the painted shutters of nearby houses, now felt detached from the moment's cruelty. The scene was at odds with itself. The beauty of the surroundings clashed with the ugliness of what had just transpired. It seemed unfair that the world could remain so lovely while carrying such bitterness within its folds. For Daniel, the departure of the bystander brought no relief. Instead, it underscored his own defensiveness, his unwillingness to let another perspective penetrate the bubble of his assumptions. He refused to consider that maybe she'd seen something he hadn't, that maybe he'd been too quick to use his uniform as a shield and a sword. In this moment, he was too entrenched in the role he'd carved out, the officer in control, the arbiter of what belonged and what did not. He told himself he had no regrets. But somewhere in the quiet darkness of his mind, doubts hovered, waiting for a chance to surface. The small residential street continued to bask in the golden light, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. A passing sedan slowed slightly as its driver glanced curiously at the pair on the curb, then accelerated away. The wind eased, leaving the air still and heavy. As Daniel stood there, resolute in his authority, and Jonathan remained silent and humiliated, the world moved on. Indifferent. The only difference was that now a spark had been struck, a subtle warning sign that something was wrong in this picture. It would take time, and the unfolding of more difficult moments, for that spark to grow into an awareness Daniel could not ignore. For now, he held fast to his position, the uniform, the badge, all the familiar symbols that propped up his pride, unaware that the foundations of his own certainty had just begun to erode. Just as the tension threatened to boil over, Officer Anna Johnson arrived on the scene, her patrol car's headlights cutting through the growing dusk. The evening shadows had begun to stretch long and lean across the quiet street, as if trying to pull the day's warmth and light down into darkness. Anna stepped out quickly, her posture assured, the calm click of her shoes on the asphalt in stark contrast to the coiled intensity hanging between the two men. She was an officer known for her balanced judgment, for the kindness in her approach that often made her a favorite at community gatherings and department meetings alike. Just seeing her figure approach might have softened the edges of an ordinary conflict, but when she took in the sight before her, Daniel's rigid stance, Jonathan's sagging shoulders, and the heavy silence caught between them, her eyes narrowed with immediate concern. She greeted Jonathan gently, her voice warm and steady, as if daring the thick tension to disperse. "Sir," she said softly, "I heard you lost your keys. Why don't we start by retracing your steps and see if we can help you find them?" Her tone was so different from Daniel's cutting remarks that it almost felt like stepping into another world. Jonathan lifted his eyes from the pavement. There was relief in his glance, a quiet gratitude that he hadn't yet dared to show in front of Daniel. At that moment, Anna's presence felt like a balm to him, a reminder that not everyone with a badge looked down on him with suspicion and contempt. Daniel stood off to the side, arms folded tight against his chest, as if holding himself together through sheer will. He watched Anna interact with Jonathan, feeling a strange mixture of irritation and shame. The way she knelt slightly, searching near the curb and the gutter, actually looking for the keys without accusation, made him feel as if he'd been caught playing a cruel joke. He tried to maintain his earlier stance of unquestioned authority, but Anna's calm words began to unravel it. He couldn't ignore how Jonathan's posture changed under Anna's care. His shoulders eased, his breathing steadied. The tension that Daniel had so purposefully stoked was drifting away, leaving him uncertain how to justify his earlier behavior. Anna glanced over her shoulder at Daniel, her hazel eyes holding a quiet interrogation of their own. Daniel looked back, and though she didn't say a word about what she must be thinking, he felt the weight of her disapproval. She was not a stranger to the murmurings in the station about his sometimes abrasive way of handling people who didn't meet his unspoken standards. She had heard them before. Complaints murmured by victims too timid to file formal charges. Rumors carried by colleagues who shrugged and said Daniel had a bit of an edge. Up until this moment, Anna had hoped the whispers were exaggerated, or at worst, products of Daniel's stress and long hours. But now, faced with the very scenario she wished to never confirm, she saw it. A subtle but unmistakable prejudice, a tendency toward cruelty that didn't belong on these streets they had sworn to protect. The air was cooling as evening advanced, the sun's last rays brushing the rooftops with a fading glow. The world beyond the three of them carried on. A screen door creaked open somewhere. A couple of neighbors strolled by at a distance, and the muffled hum of a car stereo drifted down the block. Anna focused on Jonathan, moving slowly around the curb, kicking aside a stray paper cup. Bending down to peer under a low bush near the fence line, she kept talking gently, not patronizingly, but like one equal human being to another. "Do you remember where you were standing when you noticed the keys were gone?" she asked, her voice a comfortable, even note in the hush. Jonathan responded in a faint, tentative tone that gained strength as he realized he was being heard, not judged. "I think I might have tossed them by mistake when I cleared out my pocket," he said, gesturing to the trash. "I didn't even realize until I was halfway down the block. I thought maybe—" His voice trailed off, as if unsure if it was safe to hope for compassion. Anna nodded, gave a small, encouraging smile, and crouched down to carefully sift through the container's top layer. It was an unpleasant task, but she performed it without complaint. Behind her, Daniel hovered, watching the delicate interplay. He noticed how, even in a difficult situation, Anna retained her professionalism and kindness. He admired her skill, had always done so, but now that admiration was undercut by a piercing discomfort, he could see himself reflected in her reaction, and that reflection was not flattering. She didn't say a word of rebuke, but her silence was potent. It carried expectations, that an officer knew when to step back, when to treat people with decency rather than suspicion. Jonathan waited, hands at his sides, uncertainty etched into the tight lines around his eyes. He seemed caught between relief that someone had taken him seriously and lingering fear that the fragile moment of understanding might shatter. When Anna stood up again, shaking her head that she didn't see anything yet, it didn't feel like a defeat, just a step in a process. They'd look again. They'd figure it out. That was the energy she brought. Patience and willingness to help. It was everything Daniel had withheld. Unable to stand idly by, Daniel moved a step closer, his posture stiff, as if he thought being near them might somehow restore his authority. But the authority he clung to felt hollow now. There was no going back to the moment before Anna arrived, before her gentle voice and open manner had reminded him of what he was supposed to stand for. He could feel the subtle change in the air, the sense that one more line had been drawn between the kind of officer he was and the kind he should have been all along. A quiet force pressed against him, the weight of Anna's silent judgment, the echo of that bystander's concerned gaze, the lingering humiliation he'd inflicted on Jonathan. All of it aligned in a way that made it harder to deny what had happened here. He said nothing, not yet. He didn't know what words would fix what he'd done, but as Anna continued to help Jonathan, Daniel stood rooted beside the curb, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. Unseen and unheard, that knot contained regret and a faint, unfamiliar pang of shame. It was a weight he wasn't sure how to carry, but that he suspected would follow him long after Anna and Jonathan parted ways, long after the shadows of this evening gave way to a darker night. Soon after, Anna guided Jonathan gently away from the scene, speaking in low, reassuring tones. With her calm presence, it seemed less like a hostile encounter and more like what it should have been from the start, an attempt to help someone in need. Daniel stood rooted to the spot as they departed, his stance still stiff, but he no longer felt sure of its meaning. He'd let Anna take the lead without protest, and now he watched them go, his eyes lingering on Jonathan's weary silhouette. He tried to justify his conduct, telling himself he had been doing his job, maintaining order, yet the excuse rang hollow in his ears. He headed back to the station under a sky that had darkened into a dusky purple, street lamps flickering to life along the route. Each step felt heavier than usual. The quiet hum of Brookfield's evening company drowned the sounds of the evening discharge of suet sirens and the soft chatter of neighbors parting ways as the streets grew back to normal. The soft chatter of neighbors parting ways did nothing to soothe him. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that trailed him like a persistent shadow. Once inside the familiar corridors of the station, Daniel expected to find comfort in routine. The squat brick building, with its pale linoleum floors and humming fluorescent lights, represented the heart of his professional life. Most nights it offered him a sense of purpose, of control, but not tonight. He walked past a couple of fellow officers who nodded his way, their greetings muted by his clouded mood. He offered them brief nods in return, but words felt elusive, as if he didn't trust what might come out of his mouth. He made his way to the squad room, the overhead lights buzzing gently, illuminating the neat rows of desks and the bulletin board plastered with community alerts. missing pet notices, and department schedules. Daniel settled at his desk and reached for the stack of new reports, hoping the familiarity of paperwork might quiet the thoughts rattling inside his head. He shuffled through routine calls-in-place complaints, a minor fender bender, a shoplifting incident at the convenience store on Pine Street, until a particular case file caught his eye. It was a missing child report. He recognized the official formatting, the neat lines of typed text detailing a disappearance that had occurred 2 days ago. He lifted the manila folder slowly, easing it open as if it were something delicate. A photograph slipped halfway out. A school portrait of a young girl with large, hopeful eyes and a bright, beaming smile. Her name was printed on the top right corner, Maya Morgan. Maya Morgan. The surname struck a chord in his memory, reverberating through his mind. Morgan. Jonathan Morgan. He froze, the pieces falling into place. He'd just encountered a man named Jonathan Morgan, a man he had humiliated, a man whose pleas for understanding he had batted aside with sneers and mockery. And here, in his hands, was a file that bore the same last name. His breath caught in his throat, and a strange tightness bloomed behind his ribs. He flipped through the details mechanically, eyes scanning but not fully processing. Maya was only 8 years old. She had been missing for 48 hours, last seen playing in her own backyard. The description painted her as bright and curious, a child who loved her green hair ribbons and always insisted on helping her dad with chores around the house. The primary contact listed was her father, Jonathan Morgan. Daniel's grip on the file tightened. It felt suddenly very real, painfully personal. The man he had insulted on the street, the one he had looked down upon as some kind of lowly scavenger, was not merely an inconvenience or a suspicious figure. He was a father, one who, according to these pages, had been trying to find his missing daughter. Jonathan's frantic search through the trash was not some petty or illicit act. It was the desperate measure of a man who would stop at nothing to find any clue that might lead him back to his child. Daniel let the file drop onto the desk, and it made a dull slap against the wood. He stared down at the photo again, at that little girl's hopeful smile. A heavy stone of regret settled in his gut, dragging his heart down with it. He felt a wave of self-reproach so strong it surprised him. He had mocked a father in the midst of his worst nightmare. He had taken one of the most vulnerable moments in that man's life and twisted it into an opportunity to flex his authority, to reinforce a judgment that now seemed so cruel and baseless. The squad room suddenly felt stifling. He could hear the quiet tapping of another officer's keyboard in the corner, the soft murmur of voices from down the hall. The ordinary sounds of the workplace only intensified his sense of dislocation. Where earlier he had told himself he was just doing his job, he now saw how thoroughly he had failed its true spirit. He imagined Anna, calm and kind, helping Jonathan, maybe searching alleys or checking with neighbors to find even the smallest lead. Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head slowly as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. How would Anna see him now, knowing what she knew? And Jonathan, what could he possibly say to the man if he ever saw him again? How could he face him, knowing that he had added cruelty to a burden already too heavy to bear? In the dim fluorescent light, Daniel realized he had some choices ahead of him. He could push these feelings aside, bury them deep and pretend they didn't matter. He could keep going as before, justifying his earlier behavior. Or he could acknowledge the truth, that he had been wrong, profoundly and painfully wrong. He could take this moment of clarity and learn from it, become better, if only he had the courage to do so. For now he sat there, elbows propped on the desk, head bowed. The missing child's photograph watched him silently, her innocent gaze reminding him that this story was far bigger than his own pride or discomfort. He felt the stone in his gut grow heavier as he considered Jonathan's face, the shame in his eyes, the forced calm in his voice. Regret settled in like a permanent resident, and Daniel knew that he could not escape it easily. Guilt gnawed at Daniel with an insistence he couldn't ignore. He left the station in a rush, the sound of his boots echoing down the short corridor as he stepped into the warm late evening air. The sky was deepening to a rich indigo, stars faintly pricking at its edges, while streetlights flickered to life one by one. He climbed into his patrol car and gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles bleaching white. As he pulled onto the quiet streets of Brookfield, he could hardly recognize the sense of purpose that used to guide him. Now, that assurance was replaced by a hollow ache. He replayed the image of Jonathan in his mind, the anxious set of his jaw, the nervous tension braced across his shoulders. Daniel recalled how he'd mocked the man's search, how he'd sneered and belittled him. And now, he knew, Jonathan had never been rummaging pointlessly. He had been looking for any shred of evidence, any small lead that might guide him to his missing child. Not keys, clues, a lost ribbon, a note, something someone left behind. The realization stung, each thought a sharp needle pricking at Daniel's conscience, drawing out a remorse that left him breathless. As he drove deeper into the residential neighborhood, the houses were spaced a bit more widely, the lawn slightly more worn around the edges. According to the report, Jonathan's address was on a modest cul-de-sac, with older homes and well-loved gardens. Daniel tried to imagine what Jonathan's life looked like before all this, before worry had hollowed out his gaze. He pictured Jonathan as a father beaming down at Maya's bright face, pushing her on a swing or helping her learn to ride a bike. Each hopeful image clashed with the memory of his own cruelty, twisting in Daniel's gut until he could scarcely stand it. The cruiser's headlights swept across the front porch of a small, single-story home. The paint was a bit faded, the yard simple but tidy. It looked like the sort of place where life's dramas were usually small. A house built for family dinners, friendly neighbors, and quiet nights. Daniel turned off the engine, the hum of the car fading into the distant murmur of a television set somewhere down the street. The silence pressed in on him. He swallowed hard, then stepped out, uniform creaking slightly as he stood beneath a lone porch light. He approached the door with a new humility, one hand hesitating near his belt. There was no reason to posture this time. He was not here to accuse, but to listen, to understand. He rapped softly on the doorframe, feeling the weight of his badge as if it were pulling him down. He wondered what Jonathan would see when he opened that door. Would he recognize the officer who had sneered at him just hours before, or would his grief overshadow all else? It took a moment, but the door cracked open. Jonathan stood there, illuminated by the soft glow of the living room lamp behind him. His posture was guarded, his eyes hollowed with worry and sleepless nights. Daniel saw the flicker of recognition, the uneasy tightening at the corners of Jonathan's mouth. There was no welcome on his face, and Daniel did not expect one. Only a cautious stillness, like a man bracing for another blow. "Mr. Morgan," Daniel began, voice lower and gentler than before. He noticed that Jonathan's gaze remained skeptical, as if questioning the sudden change in tone. Daniel had no illusion that words would make this right, not easily. He took a step back, giving Jonathan some space, and peered past his shoulder into the living room. The walls inside were decorated with an array of photographs. Maya grinning through missing baby teeth, Maya perched on her father's shoulders, Maya laughing so hard her eyes were squinted shut. There were school portraits and snapshots from vacations, images of a childhood that, until 2 days ago, had likely felt safe and ordinary. Jonathan's voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper when he spoke. "I served overseas," he said, unprompted, as if the need to explain himself outweighed any anger he felt. "Came back with a handful of medals, a couple of scars, and a promise to give my daughter a good life." His words were steady, though Daniel noticed how Jonathan's jaw clenched between sentences, how his eyes briefly glistened as they darted toward the photographs. "I thought Brookfield would be peaceful, a place where Maya could grow up without ever knowing the kind of fear I've seen in the world." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Jonathan had risked his life in service to a country that included this very town, and Daniel himself. He had chosen Brookfield as a place of refuge and hope, never imagining that fate would tear his child from him, leaving him desperate enough to search through garbage bins on the off chance of finding a clue. And Daniel, instead of seeing a father's anguish, had chosen to see only suspicion and difference. No scripted apology formed on Daniel's tongue. Words felt insufficient, too flimsy to hold the magnitude of his remorse. He just stood there, absorbing the gravity of Jonathan's pain and the significance of all those framed smiles, souvenirs of a time that could never be fully recovered unless Maya came home safe. The silence stretched, punctured only by the creaks of the old house and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower winding down. Daniel realized Jonathan had let him into this fragile world, at least a little, by answering the door and speaking openly. Jonathan could have slammed it in his face, refused any conversation. Instead, he revealed pieces of his story, his past, trusting that maybe now this officer might choose to understand rather than judge. Standing in that modest entryway, Daniel felt the full weight of his earlier actions crash over him. He had failed as a protector, as an officer meant to serve. He had fallen into a trap of his own making, shaped by prejudices he barely acknowledged before. He met Jonathan's gaze as best he could, the emptiness in that stare more haunting than any words of blame. That emptiness, Daniel realized, was not only a product of fear and loss. It was also the mark left by those who had failed to help, who had refused to see Jonathan's humanity when he needed them to. In that vulnerable moment, Daniel understood something important. No badge or uniform would shield him from the responsibility of his own choices. He stood on Jonathan Morgan's porch, feeling smaller than he ever had in the face of a man who deserved compassion and support. And as the night deepened outside, he knew that the path forward, towards some measure of redemption, would not be easy, but it had to start with acknowledging the harm he'd done. Jonathan's voice cracked as he began to speak, the sound emerging like the tentative strike of a match in a dimly lit room. His words drifted into the heavy silence, each syllable burdened with grief and disbelief. A single tear glinted at the corner of his eye, threatening to fall, but Jonathan blinked it back fiercely. He described finding that ribbon caught on the fence, the one Maya wore every day because it matched her eyes. He'd held it in trembling fingers, realization dawning in a heartbeat. After that, everything became a frantic blur. Calling her name until his throat went raw, searching the alley behind the house, checking under every car, peering through the unlit recesses of old sheds and cluttered garages, looking through trash cans and abandoned lots, anywhere he imagined a frightened child might hide, or worse, be hidden against her will. He'd gone back to the station again and again, pleading with them to do more, to find new angles, to treat Maya's disappearance with the urgency it deserved. He had tried to be patient, tried to trust the system, but his patience was running thin, worn down by the terror clawing at his heart. Jonathan's words tumbled out haltingly, as if each sentence cost him a piece of himself. The muscles in his jaw flexed, his hands curled into fists at his sides, before going slack again. Even as he spoke, his gaze darted around the room, as though Maya might suddenly materialize in a familiar corner, or peek around the living room doorway with an impish grin. The photographs on the walls, Maya on her bike, Maya smiling in a school costume, Maya standing proudly next to her father, watched over this heartbreak, mute witnesses to a life that had been shattered without warning. Their cheerful colors and bright laughter seemed cruel now, a reminder of how swiftly an ordinary day could twist into unending dread. Daniel stood there, his pulse a hollow thump in his ears, rooted to the spot by shame and remorse. Only hours ago he had mocked this very man. He had treated Jonathan like some lowly scavenger, a troublemaker who had no business lurking in a nice suburban neighborhood. Yet here he was, a father in unimaginable pain, trying to remain composed in front of an officer who had done nothing but belittle him. In that moment, Daniel understood with crushing clarity how wrongly he had judged Jonathan, sizing him up by his appearance, his desperation, and the circumstances he didn't bother to learn. That mocking question, "Lost what? Your pride," echoed now with a nauseating bitterness. He wished he could seize those words out of the air and swallow them back down. It struck Daniel with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Jonathan was not some suspicious stranger invading Brookfield's neat order. He was a father grappling with something that would break most people, a man who had served his country, who had come here dreaming of a peaceful life for the daughter he adored. And Daniel, through his impatience and presumptions, had poured salt on a gaping wound. He had become another obstacle, another hurt in a world that had already dealt Jonathan a devastating blow. Shame seeped into every crevice of Daniel's thoughts, eroding the confidence he once wore like armor. If he had listened, if he had taken just a breath to consider that Jonathan might have a reason beyond petty mischief, if he had looked past his uniformed self-image and met Jonathan's eyes, really met them, he would have seen the fear and pain there all along. But he hadn't. He had chosen another path, guided by a prejudice he didn't even know he carried, one that turned his uniform's purpose upside down. He was supposed to protect people, to serve them, and he had failed spectacularly. Every photograph in that living room, every polite word that Jonathan had forced himself to utter through trembling lips served as a reproach. Daniel felt the weight of his badge, the press of the silence between them. He longed to say something that might help, but what words could he offer now? An apology seemed both necessary and wholly inadequate. Too late to erase what had happened, too small to heal the profound wound he had inflicted, yet he knew he would have to say it anyway, to try and convey his regret. It would be the first step along a long road to some form of redemption, if Jonathan would allow him the chance. As he stood there, Daniel saw how Jonathan's resolve and gentleness towered over anything he himself had shown that day. This was a man who had risked his life overseas, who had seen horrors Daniel could only imagine, and who had returned determined to give his daughter a life free from fear. Now his worst fear was realized, and Daniel had greeted his panic and desperation with scorn. A hot flush of remorse crept up Daniel's neck. He had to face it. Jonathan was, in every way that counted, the better man. Daniel had mistaken a loving father's desperation for something sinister and strange. The truth cut him deeper than he ever expected. Eyes fixed on the pain etched into Jonathan's face, Daniel let the humiliation settle into his bones. He forced himself not to turn away. This was his burden to carry. All he could do now was accept what he had done and learn from it, to vow silently that he would never again allow bias and cruelty to guide him, that he would not fail someone this way again. He might not be able to save Maya. He didn't even know where to start. But he could at least stand with Jonathan, not against him, and try to make a difference before it was too late. Daniel's chest tightened as remorse filled every corner of his mind, pressing inward until he could hardly breathe. He was not accustomed to feeling this kind of shame. He had believed himself decent, fair, maybe even compassionate at times. But now he had to face what he had done. He had flung casual cruelty at a man who was already wounded. The weight of that realization made him feel unsteady, as if the solid floor beneath his feet had softened into something uncertain. Jonathan stood just a few steps away, watching Daniel through narrowed, wary eyes. For a moment neither man spoke, and the silence was immense. In it hovered the memory of Daniel's sneering questions, the humiliation he had heaped on a father who was grasping at any thread of hope. Each unspoken second stretched taut, threatening to snap. Daniel felt the pulse at his temples, the dryness of his throat. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice quiet and rough. He forced himself to meet Jonathan's gaze, not to look away as he had before. "I misjudged you. I should have listened." The words came out stiff at first, as if his tongue had forgotten how to shape an honest apology, but he meant them. He hoped Jonathan could see that. He hoped Jonathan could feel the sincerity behind them and understand that he was not speaking just to ease his own guilt, but because he recognized that he'd done real harm. Jonathan's brows drew together, and for a moment Daniel saw raw hurt shimmering behind his eyes. Jonathan had every reason to reject this apology, to turn his back and send Daniel away. Instead, something else flickered there. Cautious, uncertain hope, like a small light kindled in a darkened hallway. Jonathan said nothing immediately. Perhaps he was weighing Daniel's words, deciding if he was worth another chance. His face showed layers of emotion, anger that still simmered, hurt that had not yet healed, and a trembling desire to believe that Daniel meant what he said, that this officer who had once seen him as nothing but a nuisance now recognized him as a grieving father. "I know I can't fix what I did," Daniel continued, voice growing steadier. He held his cap in his hands, wringing the brim unconsciously. "But I want to help find Maya. I want to do whatever I can." In his words, there was no more mockery, no more pretense. He needed Jonathan to understand that he was sincere, that his apology wasn't an empty gesture designed to smooth things over. He was determined to prove he could do better, that he could be the kind of officer who truly served, rather than judged. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the small town in a quiet hush. Brookfield's well-tended lawns and familiar streets were now outlined in shadows. A porch light flickered in the distance, and a lone car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the window. Beyond that, silence reigned. It was as if the town, too, was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if the man in the uniform would live up to his words. Jonathan's jaw worked as if he were chewing on what he wanted to say. He finally nodded, but it was a hesitant motion, as if he were putting fragile faith in Daniel's hands. "I need all the help I can get," Jonathan said, voice rough but clear. He sounded tired, as if he'd been running on fumes for days. He was tired of searching alone, tired of meeting dead ends, tired of knocking on doors and finding nothing. If Daniel was willing to stand beside him now, then he would accept that help, no matter how uncertain he felt. His daughter's life mattered more than pride or resentment. Relief washed over Daniel. He wouldn't have blamed Jonathan if he'd told him to leave and never come back. But instead, here they stood, forging a fragile understanding. Daniel wanted to say more. He wanted to promise that he would leave no stone unturned, that he would call in every resource and follow every lead. But he could sense that Jonathan did not need more words right now. He needed action. He needed to know that Daniel would keep this promise, that the apology would manifest as deeds, not just empty assurances. Outside, the air had grown cooler. A faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a train passing through the outskirts of town seemed to fill the silence with a low, steady hum. Daniel turned slightly, glancing toward the street, wondering where Anna might be at this very moment. He knew that she would be out there searching too, using her patience and empathy to coax out clues that might lead them closer to Maya. He felt a new sense of purpose settle in the marrow of his bones. He looked back at Jonathan, who stood beneath the glow of a soft lamp, photographs of Maya still watching from the walls. Daniel dipped his head, acknowledging the trust that Jonathan had just bestowed upon him. "We'll find her," he said quietly, doing his best to make it sound like a vow. Jonathan's nod this time was stronger, and though the sadness and fear remained etched on his face, there was now the faintest edge of resolve as well. As they prepared to step into the darkness beyond the front door, Daniel vowed silently that he would not fail this man again. He would be better, he would do better, and he prayed that somewhere out there, amid the quiet streets and shadowed corners of Brookfield, a small clue or a kind stranger would lead them to Maya. Until then, he and Jonathan would stand side by side, linked by a terrible urgency, their differences overshadowed by a shared goal and a fragile but significant understanding. Working together through the darkness, Daniel and Jonathan moved with grim determination, shining their flashlights down streets emptied of their usual soft glow. The hush of midnight blanketed Brookfield's corners and alleyways, leaving only the whisper of distant traffic and the low hum of power lines overhead. Each footstep felt heavy yet urgent. After hours of sifting through silence and shadows, any small sound, a rustle of leaves, a clink of distant metal, could send their hearts pounding. They had searched behind old garages with paint peeling in silent streaks, circled the edges of vacant lots where tall weeds and rusted fences bore silent witness, and peered into abandoned buildings where their flashlights carved trembling cones of light through dusty gloom. It was a tip that finally broke the stalemate. A hurried phone call from someone who thought they'd seen a girl's silhouette slipping into an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Daniel and Jonathan exchanged quick glances, resignation and hope entwined. And then Daniel called for backup on his radio, voice tight but controlled. He navigated them through half-familiar streets, weaving around the hushed outskirts where lamplight grew sparse and buildings hunched in tired resignation against the sky. Jonathan followed wordlessly, his shoulders tense, his hands tightening into fists every so often, as if resisting the desperate urge to run ahead blindly. They reached the warehouse, a structure of corrugated metal and cracked windows that rose out of the night like the skeleton of a forgotten era. Paint had flaked from its sides, and metal shutters sagged, leaving gaps wide enough to slip through. Daniel's beam of light cut across old pallets and toppled barrels, revealing only rust and silence. The backup team hung back, forming a secure perimeter, as Daniel and Jonathan ventured inward, hearts in their throats. The air smelled of damp wood and stale dust, pressing in as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for this moment to unfold. Then a sound, soft sobs, muffled whimpers, caught their ears. Jonathan froze, his entire body going rigid with recognition. Daniel steadied him with a hand on the shoulder, then angled his flashlight toward the source. Behind a stack of old crates, near a corner that smelled vaguely of mold and old paper, they caught a glimpse of movement. Daniel's light settled on a small shape curled into itself, trembling. As the beam illuminated the scene, both men's hearts surged. Maya lifted her tear-streaked face, blinking at the sudden brightness, her eyes wide and glassy with terror. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair askew, the green ribbon absent now. She looked smaller than Jonathan remembered, as if fear had shrunk her back to some younger, more vulnerable version of herself. The sight of her, alive and real, was almost too much to bear. Relief hit Daniel with physical force, buckling something inside him. It wiped away any lingering attempts at composure, leaving behind only a fierce gratitude that this child was here, unhurt. Before Daniel could form a single word, Jonathan surged forward with desperate speed, dropping to his knees among the old crates. He gathered Maya into his arms, pulling her close, pressing his lips to her hair and murmuring, "I'm here, baby, I'm here." His voice cracked on each syllable, tears spilling freely now, running unchecked down the curve of his cheeks. Maya clung to him, crying softly, her small hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. The dull overhead beams and scattered debris fell away, leaving only a father and daughter reunited against all odds. Daniel stood a few steps back, still holding the flashlight, feeling something profound shift within him. He watched this reunion with an awe he could barely contain. He'd known this moment would matter, that he wanted it to happen more than anything else, but actually seeing it unfold rattled him to his core. Here was Jonathan, the man he had once ridiculed, the man he had viewed with suspicion and derision, proving without words how wrong Daniel had been. His love for Maya was written into every line of his face, every tremble of his voice. The intensity of that love dwarfed any petty assumption Daniel had ever made. Police radios crackled behind them, distant voices confirming the find, calling for medics to check Maya over, discussing next steps. Daniel heard it all, as if from underwater, the sounds muffled and far away. He was rooted in this moment, witnessing the grace that comes when fate offers a second chance. He could have ruined everything with his cruelty and pride, could have closed himself off. Instead, he had chosen to change, and though it did not erase the past, it opened the door to something better. Jonathan rocked Maya gently, wiping her tears away with the back of his hand, whispering reassurances that everything would be all right. He glanced up at Daniel, meeting the officer's gaze, not with anger or accusation, but with a complicated look that held gratitude, relief, and perhaps the beginning of forgiveness. Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had done the right thing this time, and it mattered. As the backup team moved in, as the world beyond the warehouse's corrugated walls slowly returned, Daniel switched off his flashlight. The darkness was no longer as frightening, not now that Maya was safe in her father's arms. He could still feel the hum of regret and shame beneath his skin, a reminder of how easily he had veered off track. But in this victory, in the sobs and laughter of a reunited family, he found a reason to believe he could become a better man, and for now, that was enough. Back under the familiar glow of the street lamps, the night's chill settled softly over the empty streets. The ordeal was over, and a gentle hush had fallen, as though the whole town held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jonathan stood beside Daniel, Maya clinging tightly to her father's hand. She looked exhausted, her tear-stained cheeks illuminated by the warm light. Jonathan, too, seemed utterly drained, his shoulders still heavy with lingering dread and relief. But there was a new calm in the way he held his daughter's hand, as if holding on to her future with both fists. Daniel removed his cap, unable to meet Jonathan's eyes at first. He stared down at the cracked pavement, at his polished shoes, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant wood smoke. Everything felt strangely quieter now, each small sound amplified in the silence that had fallen between them. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper, yet charged with an honesty he hadn't allowed himself before. "I was wrong about you," he said, and his voice caught halfway. It took more effort than he had imagined to force each word out, to shape them into a confession he could never have dreamed of making just hours earlier. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you." There was no excuse trailing behind his apology, no attempt to justify what had happened. Daniel understood now that nothing could excuse the way he had used suspicion and authority as weapons against a man who needed help. Jonathan listened, the lines of sorrow and exhaustion etched into his face, making him look older than he was. He nodded, a quiet acceptance, though the pain still lingered in the set of his jaw and the slight tremor at the corners of his eyes. Jonathan did not speak. He had already said all he needed to say. His silence wasn't cold or punitive. It carried a weight that Daniel could feel, the understanding that words alone could not erase the damage done, but there was also something else. A recognition that this was a first step. A moment that, if nurtured, could lead to something better. As father and daughter turned away, Maya leaned closer to Jonathan, and he wrapped an arm protectively around her. They began walking down the quiet street, heading toward home, or at least toward whatever refuge they could find in the aftermath of this harrowing night. Daniel watched them go, his heart heavy and yet somehow hopeful. He held his cap in his hands, turning it absently. He felt the weight of his actions settle deep into his bones, pressing inward with a gravity that would not be shaken off easily. The warm lamplight stretched their shadows down the sidewalk, father and daughter, side by side, making their way through the darkness and back into their own world. Daniel knew, as he stood there, that he would carry the regret of this night forward, all the way into tomorrow and beyond. He understood that he'd have to answer to his conscience long after these streets fell silent again. It was a burden he accepted. Perhaps he could use it to remind himself that justice was more than a badge and a gun. It was humanity, compassion, the willingness to listen, and the courage to confront prejudice, even the quiet kind that clung secretly to his thoughts. It would mean doing his job not as a self-appointed judge of character, but as a servant to the people who lived here, protecting them not just from crime, but from cruelty, callousness, and indifference. In the quiet, moonlit moment that followed, as Daniel looked out over the empty street, he made a silent vow. He would challenge the assumptions he once held close. He would learn to see more clearly, listen more carefully, and care more deeply. This was the start of his long journey toward redemption, a path he knew would be marked by uncomfortable truths and the hard work of reshaping himself. But as he lingered there, he understood that this was how it had to be. Because real justice meant not only ensuring that others were safe and respected, but also confronting the failures in himself and striving, always striving, to become better than he had been. Daniel Reed slipped his cap back onto his head, exhaled a long, quivering breath, and stepped forward into the night.